A cardboard box hit the sidewalk hard and split clean open. Papers scattered across the pavement. Old papers. The kind nobody keeps unless they mean something. Envelopes with handwriting on them. A phone bill from a decade ago. A photograph that landed face down and stayed there. A lamp followed. Then a trash bag cinched at the top, bulging with soft things. Then another box after that. Two men in gray shirts came out of the apartment building carrying pieces of someone's life like it was furniture nobody had paid for. They weren't rough about it. They weren't gentle either. They were just fast. They had somewhere else to be after this. A woman stood in the doorway, arms crossed, not moving. She watched every item come through that door the way a person watches a car accident they can't stop. Not because she wanted to see it. Because looking away felt like giving up the last thing she had. The right to witness what was being done to her. Her name was Lorraine Hadley, 75 years old, 5'2", a retired seamstress who had lived in that apartment since 1983, 41 years behind that door. And now on a Tuesday morning in July, she had 30 minutes to be gone. A neighbor stood across the street with a coffee cup in his hand. He said absolutely nothing. He didn't come over. He didn't call anyone. He just stood there, the way people stand when they know something wrong is happening and have already decided it's not their business. A shopping cart sat at the curb, half full already, not with groceries, with the things Lorraine had managed to pull together before the men in gray got there. A plastic bin of documents, a coat, a small wooden crucifix wrapped in a dish towel. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just watched her life come out in pieces and land in a pile on the concrete. Most people in her position wait for help that never comes. They call a number. They sit in a chair at some office. They fill out a form. They wait. And they wait. And nothing happens fast enough. And by the time something does happen, they've already fallen so far that the help doesn't reach the place they actually are. Lorraine did something different. What she built in the months that followed in the dark beneath a city that had forgotten she existed is why I'm telling you this story. Stay right with me on this one. You're going to want to hear every word. Lorraine Hadley moved into that apartment on Brecker Street in the fall of 1983. She was 34 years old. Her husband, Arthur, was 36. Their youngest, Keith, was still in diapers. Their daughter, Jeanette, was 7, already reading chapter books, already telling everyone at school that her mother made dresses for a living. Which was mostly true, though Lorraine did a lot more alterations than original work in those days. Arthur drove a delivery truck for a linen company in Queens. He was a quiet man who came home tired and sat in the same chair every evening with his shoes off and the radio on low. He wasn't the kind of husband who brought flowers. He was the kind who fixed the leak under the sink without being asked and never mentioned it afterward. Lorraine appreciated that more than flowers. Flowers die in a week. A sink that doesn't leak lasts years. The apartment was on the 4th floor. 2 bedrooms, a bathroom with a tub that took 11 minutes to fill with hot water. A kitchen where the light came in strongest in the mornings. The building was old, but solid. Brick and plaster and radiators that knocked and hissed through the winter, like they were having an argument with the cold. Lorraine could hear the street from the kitchen window. She liked that. The sound of traffic and voices and someone's radio playing from a parked car on a Saturday afternoon. It made the apartment feel connected to something. She wasn't a woman who liked silence. Silence reminded her too much of the house she grew up in when the electricity went out, which happened more often than it should have. She grew up in a place where 6 people shared 2 rooms, where winter meant one working burner on the stove and blankets piled so high you couldn't turn over without dislodging something. She learned to cook on that one burner. She learned to keep warm with what was available. She learned early that comfort is not something the world hands you. It's something you build with your hands from whatever materials are within reach. She had been building things her whole life. Arthur and Lorraine made that apartment into a home, not a showpiece, not something you'd see in a magazine, just a place where the kids knew which drawer the good scissors were in, where the bathroom door stuck if you closed it too hard, where the smell of garlic and onions on a Sunday evening meant Lorraine was making something that would feed them through Monday and Tuesday too. The neighbors knew her name, Mrs. Hadley on the 4th floor, the seamstress, the one who could fix a zipper or take in a waistband and have it back to you by Thursday. The one who kept her hallway mat clean and never played music past 9 at night. The corner bodega kept her brand of coffee on the shelf. Not because she bought a lot of it, because she'd been buying it for so long that the owner's son, who had taken over from his father, just kept ordering it out of habit. That's what 41 years in one place does. It weaves you into the fabric of a block so slowly you don't notice until someone tries to pull you out. She knew which steps on the staircase creaked. 3rd from the top on the 2nd floor landing, and the first one after the turn on the 4th. She skipped them without thinking when she came in late from evening mass. She knew the rhythm of that building the way a musician knows a song they've played 1,000 times. She didn't have to think about it anymore. It was just in her. Arthur passed in 2011. Heart attack. Quick, the doctor said, like that was supposed to be comforting. Lorraine sat in the kitchen for 3 days after the funeral and drank coffee and didn't answer the phone. On the 4th day, she got up, washed the dishes, and went back to work. She was a seamstress for 37 years. Most of that time, she worked out of a shop on the same block, a narrow storefront between a laundromat and a place that sold used electronics. The shop belonged to a woman named Marge, who retired in 2002 and handed the keys to Lorraine for the same rent she'd been paying since 1996. Lorraine ran it alone after that. Just her and the machine and the radio and the sound of thread going through fabric. She could do things with a needle that most people don't believe are possible. Invisible mending. Blind hems so clean you couldn't find the stitch unless you knew where to look. She had hands that understood cloth the way some people's hands understand piano keys. She retired at 68 when her eyes started going. Not blind. Just not sharp enough anymore for the close work. The kind of loss that doesn't show up on a medical chart the way it shows up at a sewing table at 10 o'clock at night, when the thread keeps slipping and you realize your hands aren't the problem. Her Social Security came in at just over $1,000 a month. For years, that was enough. Rent was $800. She ate carefully. Rice and beans. Chicken when it was on sale. Vegetables from the stand on the corner when they marked things down at the end of the day. She managed. She wasn't comfortable, but she was steady, and steady was worth more to her than comfortable had ever been. Then the building sold. The new owner's name was Brennan. He wasn't a villain. That's the thing people want when they hear a story like this. They want a villain, someone to be angry at. Someone who kicked in the door and threw an old woman out on the street for sport. Brennan didn't do that. He never even met Lorraine. He bought a building. He looked at the numbers. He decided the rents were below market. He raised them. $400 more a month across the board. He gave 90 days notice. He filed every paper correctly. He followed the law to the letter, every comma, every deadline, every procedural requirement. And the law, being what it is, moved at its own speed and in its own direction. And that direction was the sidewalk. Lorraine fell behind in February. The math wasn't complicated. $1,042 coming in, $1,200 going out. That's a gap that doesn't close with careful eating. That's a gap that grows. By April, a notice was on her door. Yellow paper, legal language, a date at the bottom that meant something different than the words above it. The words above it talked about arrears and remediation and right to cure. The date at the bottom said, after this, none of those words matter. She went to the housing office on Fulton Street. She sat in a plastic chair for 4 hours. She filled out a form. A woman behind the counter looked at the form, looked at a screen, looked at Lorraine and said there was a program she might qualify for. But the wait list was 11 months. 11 months. Lorraine folded the papers and put them in her bag and walked home. She climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, stepping over the 3rd step from the top and the first one after the turn, and she went inside and closed the door behind her. She sat in Arthur's chair, the one by the window. The cushion was thin now. It had the permanent shape of a man who wasn't there anymore. She sat there until the light was gone from the room. By July, the men in gray shirts were on the sidewalk. She called Jeanette first, standing on the corner of Brecker and Delaney, the shopping cart beside her, the pile of her belongings on the pavement behind her, where the men had left it. She held the phone to her ear and listened to it ring 3 times before her daughter picked up. Jeanette lived outside Dallas. She'd moved there in 2007 with a man who sold insurance and who Lorraine had met exactly twice. They had 2 kids, a mortgage, a car payment, the kinds of obligations that fill a life so completely, there's no room left for the thing your mother is about to ask you. Jeanette said she was sorry. She said it twice. She said things were tight. She said maybe in a few months. She said she wished she could do more. She said a lot of things that added up to the same answer, which was no. Lorraine said she understood. She said it wasn't a problem. She said Jeanette shouldn't worry. She said all the things a mother says when she's standing on a sidewalk with everything she owns in a shopping cart, and she doesn't want her daughter to hear the sound of the street behind her. She hung up. She called Keith. Keith lived outside Phoenix. He worked in construction when there was work. He'd been in and out of something Lorraine didn't know exactly what, and she had stopped asking because the answers never made her feel better, and the silences between the answers were worse. The phone rang 4 times. 5. 6. It went to voicemail. Keith's voice, younger than the man he was now, telling the caller to leave a message. Lorraine left 1 message. She said her name. She said she was calling because she needed to talk to him. She said it was important. She said she loved him. She did not leave another message. She was not going to beg her children. You have to understand something about Lorraine Hadley. She was the kind of woman who had been taking care of herself and everyone around her since she was old enough to reach the stove. She raised 2 children. She buried a husband. She ran a business. She paid her rent on time for 41 years. She had never once in her life asked someone to save her. And standing on that sidewalk, 75 years old with nowhere to go, and a shopping cart full of everything that was left, she made a decision that some people might call pride, and other people might call something harder than that. She decided she would figure this out herself, whatever that meant, whatever it cost. That decision is where this story begins. The city shelter on Merchant Street was a building designed to hold people the way a net holds fish. Not gently, just enough to keep them from falling through. Lorraine walked through the door at 4 in the afternoon with her cart and her bag and the clothes she was wearing and nothing else. A woman behind a desk asked her name and gave her a number, and pointed to a cot in a long room with 40 other cots. The room smelled like old shoes, and something worse underneath that. A chemical smell layered over a human smell, layered over the smell of a building that had absorbed too many people's worst nights and couldn't absorb any more. She lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. The ceiling had water stains the shape of countries she'd never been to. She didn't sleep. Not that night. The second night, she slept in pieces. 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there. She dreamed about the apartment, about the kitchen light in the morning, about Arthur's chair. On the third night, someone went through her bag while she slept. They took $12 and a pair of reading glasses. They left everything else, which meant they either had standards or they were in a hurry. Lorraine was gone before sunrise. She pulled her cart through the front door and onto the street, and she did not go back. She slept in the park for about a week after that, a bench near a lamppost because the light made her feel less alone, not safe. She knew the difference. But less alone was enough to make her close her eyes. A patrol officer told her on the fourth night that she couldn't sleep there. He was young. Polite about it in the way people are polite when they're reading from a script they didn't write. She said, "Yes, officer, I understand." She stood up. She folded the blanket she'd been using. She placed it in the cart. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She had been a woman with an address 2 weeks ago, and now she was a woman being told she couldn't rest on a bench in a park she'd been walking through for 30 years. And the distance between those two things was so vast and so ordinary that there was nothing to say about it. She moved. She pushed her cart. She learned things. She learned which church steps were unlocked before 6 in the morning. Not all of them. Some had gates. Some had cameras. But a few, especially the older ones with the stone steps worn smooth by a century of feet, left their doors open early because someone inside still believed that was the point. She learned which fast food places would let you sit for an hour if you bought a small coffee. Which ones had the cleanest bathrooms, which ones had managers who looked the other way, and which ones had managers who watched the clock. She learned that public libraries open at 10 and close at 8, and that in between those hours you are allowed to be a person. You can sit in a chair. You can read a newspaper. You can use the bathroom. Nobody asks you where you live. She learned how to take up less space, how to make less noise, how to carry herself in a way that didn't attract attention. Not invisible exactly, but something close to it. Something that allowed her to move through a city of 8 million people without any of them seeing her. She was getting good at disappearing. And here's the thing about disappearing. Once you start, it's hard to stop. The world makes room for you to be gone. People stop looking. Systems stop reaching. The space you used to occupy fills in behind you, like water closing over a stone. And pretty soon there's no evidence you were ever standing there at all. Lorraine was 2 weeks from becoming permanent. 2 weeks from crossing whatever line separates a person who's having a hard time from a person who's been swallowed. She didn't know the line was there. Most people don't. You don't feel it when you cross it. You feel it after when you try to cross back. Now, here's where the story changes. There is a part of every city that most people walk past every single day without ever looking at. A staircase between 2 buildings. A gate with a rusted chain. A door at the bottom of an alley with no sign on it. These places are everywhere. They're part of the infrastructure, the skeleton of the city. The bones that hold up the surface everyone walks on. And nobody thinks about bones until something breaks. Between 2 buildings on Harwick Street, there was a staircase. Iron railing, cement steps going down into shadow. At the bottom, a door. Heavy, metal. Painted gray a long time ago, the paint now peeling in strips that curled away from the surface like dead skin. That door led to what used to be a subway station. A stretch of track that had been decommissioned in 1991 when the city rerouted the line 3 blocks north. The station had been sealed. A padlock and 2 heavy bolts on the door, and after that, nothing. No demolition. No repurposing. No plans. Just silence and darkness and time doing what time does when no one's watching. One of the bolts had corroded. Just one. The metal had gone soft with water and years. Slow decay. The kind of damage that doesn't announce itself. It just waits. One evening in late August, Lorraine pushed her cart down that alley. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She was looking for a dry place to sit. It had rained that afternoon, and the bench she'd been using behind the church on St. Clair was soaked. She leaned her back against the door at the bottom of those stairs, and the door swung inward. She nearly went with it. Her weight shifted, and her foot slipped on the wet step. And for a moment she was falling backward into nothing. Into darkness, into a space she hadn't known was there. She caught the iron railing with her right hand. Her shoulder pulled hard. She steadied herself. She stood at the top of those stairs and looked down. It wasn't pitch dark. Not entirely. Ventilation grates in the ceiling above the platform let in light during the day. Thin gray bars of it falling across old tile. The light was fading now, the sun almost gone, but she could see shapes. She could see the outline of a platform, benches, a long, quiet room below the street. She could hear nothing from down there. No traffic, no voices, no sirens, no city at all. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that has weight to it. The kind that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own breathing. She stood at the top of those stairs for a long time. She had been sleeping on benches. She had been sleeping in doorways. She had been sleeping in places where the world could reach her at any moment, where a flashlight could find her, where a voice could tell her to move, where hands could go through her bag in the dark. She looked down into that station, and she saw something she hadn't seen in weeks. A door she could close behind her. She went down. The station was maybe 200 feet from one end to the other. A single platform running along one wall. The tracks were still in the tunnel mouth at the far end, rusted and still going nowhere. The platform tiles were cracked in places, but mostly holding. Old cream-colored ceramic with a narrow stripe of dark green at eye level running the length of the wall. The kind of tile they put in stations back when someone still cared about what underground spaces looked like. Some of the wooden bench slats had rotted out. Others held. She pressed one with her palm, and it took her weight without complaint. The ceiling was intact, concrete and steel, solid above her in a way that the open sky had never been. The walls were dry. That mattered more than anything else. Dry meant no mold. Dry meant the sleeping bag wouldn't rot. Dry meant warmth stayed where you put it instead of bleeding out into damp and gone. Lorraine walked the length of the platform and back. Her footsteps echoed in a way that made the space sound bigger than it was. She stood in the middle of it. She looked up at those grates where the last of the daylight was still coming through. Thin lines of it, like light through the slats of a blind, like the lines on a page waiting to be written on. She stood there and she thought about what this place was. An empty room, underground, forgotten, useless to the city that had built it and abandoned it. She thought about what it could be. Then she went back up. She pulled her cart to the bottom of the stairs one step at a time, careful with her knees, careful with the weight. She pulled the door shut behind her. She heard it close, and she stood in the dark, and she listened to the sound of it echoing off the tile walls and fading into the tunnel. That night, she opened the old notebook she kept in her bag. The one with phone numbers and grocery lists and a recipe for Arthur's mother's potato soup that she'd written down in 1987 and never made. She turned to a clean page. She didn't write feelings. She didn't write about what had happened. She didn't write about Jeanette's voice on the phone or Keith's voicemail or the shelter or the park bench or the officer or any of it. She wrote a list: bedding, a lamp, a bucket, a way to make heat, a lock for that door. She had $81 in her pocket. It was the third week of August. The cold was 2 months away, maybe 3 if she was lucky. She filled the whole page. She sat in the dark at the bottom of those stairs, with her back against the tile wall, and her notebook in her lap. The city was up there above her, grinding and honking and living its enormous, indifferent life. Down here there was nothing but silence and the faint smell of old concrete and the sound of her own breathing. She closed the notebook. She put the pen in her pocket. She pulled the blanket out of her cart and folded it into a pillow and lay down on the platform floor. The tile was cold, hard. It pressed against her hip and her shoulder in ways that would hurt in the morning. She didn't care. She was inside. She was dry. The door was closed. Nobody knew she was here. For the first time in weeks, she was not afraid of being found. She was 75 years old. She had $81 in a shopping cart, and a list in a notebook, and a door that nobody else knew was broken. And she was going to turn this into a home, not because she believed things would work out, not because she had faith in some system or some person or some miracle coming down the line, because she had spent her entire life building things with whatever was in front of her. A marriage, a family, a business, a life. All of it constructed piece by piece with her hands and her head, and the kind of quiet, relentless stubbornness that doesn't look like much from the outside, It just looks like a woman getting up in the morning and doing what needs doing. That's what she'd been doing for 75 years. She wasn't about to stop now. She closed her eyes. The silence settled around her. The ventilation grates let in the faintest sound from the street above. A distant horn. A voice too far away to make out the words. The low, constant hum of a city that never stops moving. Lorraine Hadley lay on the cold tile floor of an abandoned subway station, beneath the streets of the city she'd lived in her whole life. She had no address, no lease, no key, no bed, no kitchen window. She had a list. She was asleep in minutes. She went back before sunrise. The alley was empty. The bolt was still loose. The door still swung. Lorraine stood at the top of the stairs in the gray light of early morning and listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No sign that anyone had been here since she'd left. The city was barely awake above her. Just the first trucks and the faint metallic clatter of someone pulling up a security gate 6 blocks away. Down below, the station was exactly as she'd left it. Still. Dry. Waiting. She went down. She had her notebook open before she reached the bottom step. The list. She read it once, then again, then folded the page back and put the notebook in her coat pocket. $81. That was the number. Not a budget. A boundary. Everything she did for the next several weeks would have to fit inside that number. And most of what she needed would have to come from places where money wasn't the currency. Time was. Patience was. Knowing where to look and being willing to carry what you found. The first things she brought down were practical. A sleeping bag from a donation bin on Eldridge Street. She'd seen the bin 2 weeks earlier and remembered it. The sleeping bag was damp on one side, the nylon shell dark with moisture from sitting at the bottom of the pile. But the fill was intact, and the zipper worked. She draped it over the iron railing at the top of the stairs and let the morning air pull the moisture out while she went looking for the next thing. A flashlight from a dollar store, batteries included. $1.29 with tax. A battery-powered lantern she found beside a dumpster behind a hardware store on Breck Avenue. Still in the box. The box was dented and the cardboard was soft from rain, but the lantern inside was dry and clean, and when she turned the switch it threw a circle of warm light against the alley wall that made her stop and look at it for a moment. Light. She hadn't controlled her own light source in weeks. Every night since the eviction, she'd been at the mercy of whatever the city provided. Street lamps, fluorescent tubes in the shelter ceiling, the blue glow from a bodega sign. Now she held a lantern in her hand, and she decided where the light went. That mattered more than she expected. She brought them down in her cart one load at a time and set them in the corner where the wall was most solid and the ceiling highest. The platform had a slight slope toward the tracks, a drainage grate built into the original design. She chose the high side. Water, if it ever came, would run the other way. 5 trips the first day. She was 75 years old. Her knees had been telling her things for a decade, and she'd been ignoring them the way you ignore a sound in the engine that hasn't gotten bad enough to stop driving. Now, going up and down those stairs with weight in the cart, they told her clearly and loudly, and she couldn't pretend she didn't hear. She sat on the platform floor between loads, drank water from a bottle she'd filled at the park fountain, waited for her breathing to settle, waited for the heat in her knees to fade from sharp to dull. Then she got up and went again. The cart was the key to everything. She'd had it since her second week on the street. Someone had left it outside a grocery store on Polk, with a broken front wheel, the caster bent sideways so it dragged instead of rolled. She'd looked at it the way she used to look at a garment that came into the shop torn, in a way the customer thought was unfixable. She'd turned it over, found the problem, taken a piece of wire from a drain cover on the sidewalk and wrapped it tight around the caster mount until the wheel tracked straight again. Not perfect. It pulled slightly to the left, but it moved. It carried weight. It was hers. That cart carried everything. Bedding, candles she bought in bulk from a church supply store that was going out of business 8 for $1, a plastic tub for water, a heavy tarp she found in an alley beside a construction site, folded and dry, still smelling like the factory it came from. A small camp stove she paid $12 for at a second-hand shop on Fenwick, the kind that runs on butane canisters the size of a fat marker. The woman at the register looked at her when she paid for it, but didn't ask anything. Lorraine appreciated that. She was getting good at reading people's faces for the questions they were deciding not to ask. By the end of the first week, she had a sleeping area and a way to make light. The sleeping bag went on the platform floor against the wall. The lantern sat on an overturned bucket beside it. She could lie on her side and reach the switch without sitting up. That was the kind of detail that mattered when you were building a life in a space that gave you nothing for free. Every convenience had to be designed. Every comfort had to be earned. By the end of the second week, she had a curtain, a heavy drape she found at a sidewalk sale on Chestnut. Burgundy. Sun-faded along the top where it had hung in someone's window for years, but thick. The kind of fabric that blocks light and holds heat and gives a room a boundary. She knew fabric. She'd spent 37 years with fabric in her hands. She knew this piece was worth carrying down those stairs. She hung it from a wire strung between 2 old signage brackets on the platform wall. Iron brackets bolted into the tile once used to hold station maps or service announcements. They held the wire. The wire held the curtain. The curtain divided the platform into 2 spaces. Her side and the other side. That was the moment it became a home. Not when she brought the sleeping bag. Not when she turned on the lantern. When she hung that curtain and stepped behind it and stood in a space that was enclosed, that had walls and a ceiling and a boundary she had created, that was the moment. She stood there, and she felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been clenched for weeks let go just slightly, like a fist opening one finger at a time. She wasn't on the street anymore. She was inside. She was somewhere. She found a wooden crate solid enough to use as a table, hauled it down the stairs on a Thursday afternoon, her knees screaming on every step, set it beside the sleeping bag, and put the lantern on it and the camp stove next to the lantern and a library book next to the stove, and suddenly it looked like someone lived here, because someone did. A folding chair with one bent leg. She found it leaning against a fence on Waverly. She straightened the leg with a rock and a piece of rebar, working it slowly, bending the metal back a degree at a time. The way she used to ease a difficult seam into place. Patience. Pressure. Knowing when to push and when to hold. The leg wasn't perfect when she was done. It had a slight angle that made the chair lean to the left if you sat too far back. But it held. It was a place to sit that wasn't the floor, a milk crate that became a shelf. She set it on its side against the wall, and it held things. candles, a cup, a small stack of books she rotated from the library. Her documents. The documents. That was something she was not willing to leave in the cart. Not after the shelter. She'd seen what happened to things left unguarded, and she wasn't going to learn that lesson twice. She brought them down in a Ziploc bag wrapped inside another plastic bag and sealed with a rubber band. Her ID, her social security card, her old lease from the apartment, the original one from 1983, with Arthur's name next to hers. The eviction notice. She put them on the milk crate shelf where she could see them from the sleeping bag. They were proof that she existed in the way the world requires you to exist on paper. With numbers, with official language that says you are a person who belongs somewhere. She brought the photographs, not all of them. She'd lost most of them in the eviction, but she had 6. Arthur on the stoop of the building the year they moved in, squinting into the sun, his shirt collar open. Jeanette at her 8th grade graduation. Keith as a baby in a high chair, with food on his face, laughing at something off camera. The 4 of them at Coney Island, 1989. Standing in front of the Cyclone Jeanette holding a stuffed animal she'd won at a ring toss. 2 others. She kept them in the Ziploc with the documents. She brought Arthur's watch. It hadn't worked in years. The battery had died and she'd never replaced it, because replacing it felt like admitting time was still moving without him. She kept it in the Ziploc too. And the crucifix. The small wooden one her mother had given her. It had hung above every door Lorraine had ever lived behind. Every apartment. Every room. When she moved, it was the last thing to come off the wall and the first thing to go up. She put it on the wall above her sleeping bag, pressed the nail into a crack in the tile grout where the mortar was soft. It held. The crucifix hung straight the way it always had. She stood back and looked at it and nodded once. This was the part that cost her the most, not physically. What cost her was the decision-making. Every item required a calculation. Is this worth carrying down those stairs? Is this worth the space it takes? Is this worth the trip? She had to think like an engineer, not like a woman with a home. A woman with a home keeps things because they mean something. An engineer keeps things because they work. Lorraine had to be both. She had to decide which pieces of her old life earned their place in this new one. And she had to make those decisions with her knees aching and her back stiff, and her breath short at the top of the stairs. 2 things she spent real money on. No negotiation on either. A good padlock for the door, the kind with a hardened shackle you couldn't cut with a standard bolt cutter. She paid $19 for it at a locksmith on Delaney. The man behind the counter asked what it was for. She said, a storage unit. He didn't ask anything else. She locked the door from the inside at night and from the outside when she left. The corroded bolt was still loose, but the padlock held the door shut in a way the bolt never had. For the first time since August, she slept behind a locked door and a mattress. Not a whole mattress. That was impossible. You cannot carry a mattress down a flight of stairs in a shopping cart. But Lorraine knew things about materials. She'd spent her life working with layers and padding and structure. She knew where a mattress supply store on Fulton put their foam offcuts. They left them in a pile outside twice a week, Tuesday and Friday, scraps from cutting king-size pieces down to queen strips and squares and odd shapes that nobody wanted. She went on a Tuesday and picked through the pile. She chose pieces by density, pressing her thumb into each one, the way she used to test fabric weight between her fingers. She carried them down in loads tied together with electrical cord. 3 trips over 2 Tuesdays. 6 loads total. She layered them on the platform floor, 3 layers deep, arranged so the seams didn't line up the dense pieces on the bottom for support the softer ones on top. She covered them with the sleeping bag and added a wool blanket she'd bought for $4 at a thrift store on Birch. Brown wool. Heavy. The kind of blanket that means business. The first night she slept on it, she slept 9 hours straight. She hadn't done that since before the eviction. Not on the bench, not in the shelter, not anywhere. 9 hours of unbroken sleep. The kind that pulls you under and holds you there and gives you back to the morning like a different person. She woke up and lay still for a while, looking at the ceiling. The ventilation grates let in the first light of the day, pale bars of it crossing the old tile above her. She listened to the silence, and she felt for the first time in a very long time that she was not falling. She had a routine. Routine kept her steady. Every morning she went up. She was not a hermit. She was not hiding from the world. The world up there was still her world, just approached from a different angle. She went to the library 3 or 4 times a week. She used the bathroom. She filled her water jugs at the fountain near the entrance. She sat at a table and read the newspaper. The actual paper, spreading it out the way Arthur used to do on Sunday mornings. She used the computer, sometimes checking nothing in particular, just making sure she still knew how. She went to St. Anthony's on Tuesdays and Thursdays for the hot lunch. She sat with people and talked. Not about herself, not about the station. She talked about the weather and the news and whether the subway fare was going up again. She was a woman who came for lunch and left. Nobody asked her where she slept. That was the unwritten rule at places like St. Anthony's. You don't ask. People tell you what they want you to know, and you don't push for the rest. Lorraine respected that rule because she lived by it. On Sundays, she went to Mass at the church on Broome Street. She'd been attending for 30 years. Same pew, 3rd row from the back on the left side. Father Donnelly shook her hand after service and asked how she was doing. He was a tall man with a careful face, the kind of face that listens before it speaks. She said, "Fine, Father." He looked at her. That look. The one people give when they want to ask something, but the question feels too large for the space between a church door and a sidewalk. She held his gaze until he smiled and let her go. She brought water down in jugs she filled at the library and the park fountain. 2-gallon containers she'd bought at a dollar store and carried one at a time in the cart. She emptied the bucket every morning in the storm drain at the end of the alley, early, before the street had people on it, before anyone could see what she was doing or wonder why a 75-year-old woman was pouring a bucket into a drain at 5:45 in the morning. She kept her space clean, swept the platform with a broom she'd found missing half its bristles, and trimmed down to a stiff, efficient tool. Wiped the crate table with a rag. Folded the blanket every morning. Made the bed such as it was. This wasn't about pride. It was about dignity. She knew the difference between those two things, and it mattered. Pride is what you show other people. It's the face you put on when someone's watching. Dignity is what you maintain when nobody is watching at all. Dignity is sweeping a floor that no one else will ever walk on. It's folding a blanket on a mattress made of scraps in a room that used to be a subway platform. It's keeping yourself clean and your space orderly because the alternative is not a mess. The alternative is surrender. Lorraine did not surrender. She heard him before she saw him. It was a Thursday evening in mid-September. She was sitting in the folding chair reading a library book when footsteps came from the far end of the tunnel. Not from the stairs. From the tunnel itself, the trackside where the old rail line disappeared into the dark. She turned off the lantern. She sat very still. The footsteps were slow, shuffling. Not the sound of someone in a hurry. The sound of someone who knew where they were going and was in no rush to get there. A shape appeared at the edge of the platform. A man medium height wearing a heavy coat despite the fact that it wasn't that cold yet. He walked along the tracks like he'd done it before. Like this was a path he knew. He climbed up onto the platform at the far end and walked toward the stairs. He was going to pass right by the curtain. He stopped. He must have seen the faint outline of light around the edge of the fabric. Or maybe he smelled the coffee she'd made earlier. Or maybe he just knew the way people who live outside learn to know when a space has someone in it. A change in the air. A warmth that shouldn't be there. He knocked on the platform pillar. 2 slow knocks, like knocking on a door. He said, "Somebody in there." Lorraine didn't move. He waited. She said yes. He said, "Sorry to bother," and he kept walking. She heard his footsteps go up the stairs. She heard the door open and close. And he was gone. His name was Wendell. She didn't learn that until later. He was a man who used the tunnel as a shortcut between 2 streets. He'd found the same loose bolt she had maybe before her. Maybe after she never asked. He passed through every few days, always at the same time, always with the same shuffling walk, always alone. After that first night, he always knocked. 2 knocks on the pillar. The signal that it was him and not someone else. She never answered the knock with words after that first time. She just let the sound pass, and he just kept walking. It was a system. It worked. But sometimes he left things outside the curtain. A can of soup, the kind with the pull-tab lid that doesn't need a can opener. A box of matches. A newspaper folded open to the crossword like he'd started it and decided to let her finish. She never asked him why. He never asked her story. He never tried to come behind the curtain. He never lingered. He came through, he knocked sometimes. He left something and he went. That was its own kind of decency. A man passing through a dark tunnel who takes the time to knock so he doesn't scare the woman living there. Who leaves a can of soup without a note? Who never once asks for anything in return? Not a conversation. Not a thank you. Not even acknowledgement. Lorraine appreciated that more than she could have explained. One morning in early October, Lorraine came up the stairs and the cart was gone. She stood at the top of the steps and looked at the iron railing where she'd tied it. The cord was still there. Cut clean, not untied. Someone had taken it in the night. Someone with a knife or a pair of scissors, and a reason to want a shopping cart more than they cared about whoever it belonged to. The railing was empty. The alley was empty. The cart was gone. She stood there for a long time. That cart was everything. It was her truck. Her supply line, her connection between the world above and the world below. every piece of foam she'd carried down every jug of water. Every can of food, every blanket and tarp and scrap of useful material had come down those stairs in that cart. Without it, she was carrying things in her arms. And her arms were 75 years old and they could only carry so much. She didn't cry. She was past the place where crying was useful. Crying was an expression of something you expected other people to respond to, and there was no one here to respond to anything. She sat on the top step. She put her hands on her knees. She looked at the street. Then she got up. She walked 6 blocks to the back of a grocery store on Polk, where they kept the damaged carts behind a chain-link fence. The fence had a gap at the bottom where the post had pulled loose from the concrete. She pulled the gap wider and went through. She found a cart with a bent front wheel and a cracked handle. The wheel was worse than the first one, bent inward at an angle that made it scrape the ground on every rotation. She sat in the alley behind the store and worked on it for 3 hours. She used a brick to hammer the wheel caster back towards straight. She used a piece of rebar she'd been carrying in her coat pocket since September, a short length she'd picked up from a construction site, to pry the metal frame back into alignment. She wrapped the cracked handle with electrical tape she had in her bag. When she was done, the cart rolled. Not smoothly, not quietly. It pulled to the right and the wheel made a sound like a playing card in bicycle spokes. But it moved. It carried weight. She pushed it back to the alley. She tied it to the railing with wire this time, not cord. Wire is harder to cut without tools. It wouldn't stop someone determined, but it would slow them down enough to maybe not bother. She went down the stairs and sat in her chair and looked at the curtain and thought about what had just happened. She'd lost the most important tool she had, the thing that made everything else possible. And she'd replaced it in a day with nothing but her hands and a brick and a piece of rebar. But the truth underneath that small victory was this: everything she had built was fragile. Everything she owned could disappear while she slept. The line between having a home and having nothing was thinner than the wire she'd used to tie the new cart to the railing. She knew that now. She'd known it before abstractly, the way you know that weather can change. But now she felt it in her hands, in the raw place on her palm where the brick had rubbed the skin. She opened her notebook and added a line to the list, a second lock for the cart. Then she closed the notebook and made dinner. By October, the temperature outside had dropped into the 40s at night. Down in the tunnel, it stayed in the mid-50s, cold but manageable. The earth insulated the station in a way the open air never could. The concrete walls held a baseline warmth that didn't fluctuate the way surface temperatures did. When it was 42 above, it was 54 below. When it was 38 above, it was 51 below. The tunnel didn't care about the wind. She had the sleeping bag, the wool blanket, a fleece pullover she'd found in a bag left outside a thrift store on Waverly, too late for the store to accept it early enough for Lorraine to get there before the garbage truck. She wore layers to bed, not because it was unbearable, because she had learned a long time ago, back in the house where 6 people shared 2 rooms, that cold doesn't kill you in one night. It kills you slowly. It takes a little from you each time, a little warmth, a little energy, a little of the willingness to get up in the morning. You have to fight it before it gets ahead of you. She fought it. One Friday evening in late October, she made a small pot of rice and black beans on the camp stove. She cooked it slowly the way she liked with garlic she bought for 30 cents and a pinch of cumin from a jar she kept on the shelf. The smell of it filled the space behind the curtain and made it feel smaller and warmer and more like a kitchen than a subway platform. She ate it in her folding chair with a fork she'd brought from the old apartment. One of the forks from the set she and Arthur had bought at a department store in 1985. She'd carried it in her bag since the eviction. She didn't know why she'd grabbed that particular fork. She'd grabbed it without thinking, standing in the apartment as the men in gray carried her life out the door. And she dropped it in her bag the way you grab something familiar when everything familiar is disappearing. She ate. She read 2 chapters of a library book, a novel about a woman who sailed from Ireland to New York in 1952. She liked the book. It was about someone starting over in a place where no one knew her name. She understood that. She finished eating. She washed the fork in the water tub and dried it and put it back on the shelf. She turned off the lantern. She lay down and pulled the blanket up. She listened to the city above her, the distant rumble of traffic, the faint clang of something metallic far off in the tunnel, the low, constant breath of a place that never stops moving. She thought, "This is mine. Nobody can take this from me." She was asleep in minutes. She heard them before she saw anything. It was a Tuesday in mid-November. She was reading with the lantern on low, the flame of light just enough to see the page, when the footsteps came down the stairs. Not the shuffle she knew from Wendell. These were heavier, deliberate. 2 sets of them coming down with the confidence of people who had a reason to be there. And with them a flashlight. Hard white light, the kind that runs on lithium batteries and cuts through dark like it has a personal grudge against it. Lorraine turned off her lantern. She set the book on the crate table. She did not move. The steps came closer. She heard a voice, young, male, matter of fact. The tone of someone reading a checklist inside their head. "Yeah, this section looks unused. No activity signs on the north end." Another voice farther back, slightly older. "Check for any structural issues while you're down there. We need a full report by Friday." She heard the scratch of a pen on a clipboard. She heard the squeak of a boot on tile. The footsteps were maybe 30 feet away, then 20, then closer. She stayed perfectly still behind the curtain. Her hands were flat on the armrests of the folding chair. Her breathing was shallow, not panicked, controlled. The breathing of a woman who understood that what happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether everything she'd built in the last 3 months would continue to exist. The light swept past the edge of the drape. She could see the glow of it through the fabric. A bright bar sliding across the burgundy surface like headlights through a bedroom window. The footsteps stopped. "Hang on." The younger voice. Close now. Maybe 15 feet from the curtain. A pause. "This curtain wasn't here last year." Another pause. The older voice from the stairs. "Could be blowing in from somewhere." "That's not blowing." Lorraine understood in that moment that everything had shifted. She was no longer a woman surviving day by day in a place nobody knew about. She was visible now. And the difference between those 2 things was enormous. Surviving alone was something she controlled. Being found was something that belonged to a system. And systems, once they find you, don't look away. She listened. She heard him move closer. She heard his hand touch the curtain. She heard the fabric slide along the wire. He stepped onto her side of the platform. A long silence followed. She could see him now in the reflected light from his flashlight, which was pointed at the ground. Young man, early 30s, wearing a safety vest over a flannel shirt. Clipboard in one hand, the flashlight in the other, aimed low, not at her. He was looking at the space, the folding chair, the crate table with the camp stove, and the stack of library books, the milk crate shelf with the candles and the Ziploc bag of documents, the crucifix on the wall. The mattress neatly made, the blanket folded at the foot. He was seeing a home. She watched him take it in. She watched his eyes move from the crucifix to the shelf, to the sleeping area and back. She watched his face change, not shock, something slower. The quiet recalibration of a man who walked into a room expecting to find nothing and found a life instead. He said very quietly, "Oh." Then he stepped back. He moved the curtain back into place. He walked toward the stairs. Then his voice into a radio. "North section is clear. No structural issues. We'll note it in the report." A crackle. The older voice. "Copy." The footsteps went up the stairs, and they were gone. The door closed at the top. Lorraine sat in the dark for 15 minutes without moving. She sat in her folding chair with her hands on the armrests, and she listened to the silence come back and fill the space where those footsteps had been. A man she didn't know had just seen everything. Her home, her life. The evidence of 3 months of work and planning and endurance. He had seen the crucifix on the wall, and the blanket folded on the bed, and the books on the shelf. And he had made a choice. He had chosen to say the section was clear. He had chosen to look the other way. She didn't know why. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if he would keep looking the other way or if this was a kindness with an expiration date. She sat in the dark, and she breathed, and she waited for her heart to slow. 3 days later, she saw it. She came up the stairs in the morning the way she always did early before the light was fully up, the padlock undone. The door pushed open just enough to step through. She was pulling the door shut behind her when she noticed the yellow card. Laminated. Zip-tied to the iron railing at the top of the stairs. Transit Authority letterhead. Official seal in the corner. Block letters. The tunnel was scheduled for a formal engineering assessment as part of the city's infrastructure expansion plan. A full survey of structural integrity, utility access points, and potential development corridors. The date listed was December 9th, 3 weeks away. Lorraine read the card twice. She read every word on it the way she used to read contracts at the sewing shop, carefully looking for the thing that mattered underneath the language that didn't. The thing that mattered was this one worker choosing to look the other way was one thing. A formal inspection team with cameras and a written mandate to document every finding was something else entirely. It wasn't one man with a clipboard anymore. It was an institution. And institutions don't leave things blank. They don't say, "North section is clear," when the north section isn't clear. They photograph. They catalog. They fill in every line on every form because that is what they exist to do. She sat on the top step. The morning light was coming through the buildings to the east, hitting the alley wall in a stripe of pale gold. A pigeon landed on the railing 3 feet from her and looked at her with one eye. Somewhere above, a window opened and a voice called out in a language she didn't understand. She looked at the yellow card. She had 2 choices. She could clear out before the 9th, pack everything into the cart, go back up those stairs, and return to the street. She knew how to do that. She had done it before. She could be gone in a day. No trace, no evidence. Just an empty platform with some nail holes in the grout where the crucifix had been. Or she could stay. She looked at the card one more time. December 9th, 21 days. She stood up. She went back down the stairs. She hung her coat on the wire beside the curtain. She put the kettle on the camp stove. She sat in her chair and listened to the water start to heat. She was not leaving. She had spent 3 months building this. She had carried foam down a flight of stairs on her 75-year-old knees. She had fixed a shopping cart with a piece of wire. She had fixed another one with a brick. She had hung a curtain and made a bed, and swept a floor and kept herself clean and fed, and alive in a place the city had thrown away. She was not going to throw it away, too. The water boiled. She poured it into the cup with the small chip on the handle. She added the instant coffee. She stirred it with the fork from the old apartment. She drank it slowly. She had 21 days. She was going to use every one of them. She spent the next 3 weeks doing 2 things she hadn't done before. The first was talking. She had spent 3 months being careful. No stories. No details. No specifics to anyone about anything. When people at St. Anthony's asked how she was doing, she said fine. When Father Donnelly looked at her with that question in his eyes, she held his gaze and gave him nothing. She had constructed a wall of silence around the most important part of her life, and that wall had kept her safe. Now she changed. Not recklessly, not all at once. She didn't walk into St. Anthony's and announce she was living in an abandoned subway station. She wasn't that kind of woman. She was the kind who opened one door at a time, and only when she knew what was on the other side. On a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November, she sat down at the long table next to a woman she'd spoken with a few times over the past month. A volunteer named Bev. Beverly, technically, but everyone called her Bev. She was maybe 60, short gray hair, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. The kind of woman who ran things without raising her voice. She'd been volunteering at St. Anthony's for 11 years. Lorraine had noticed her early on because Bev was the only volunteer who didn't look at the people eating lunch like they were problems to be managed. She looked at them like they were people eating lunch. Lorraine set her tray down. She said hello. They talked about the weather for a minute. Then Lorraine said something she hadn't said to anyone. I have a housing situation, and I need to understand my rights. She didn't say where. She didn't say what. She said the sentence and she let it sit on the table between them like a card placed face down. Bev looked at her, not with surprise, not with pity, with the expression of a woman who had been doing this work long enough to know what a sentence like that costs the person saying it. She didn't ask questions. She reached into the pocket of her vest and pulled out a pen. She picked up a church bulletin from the stack on the table, turned it over, and wrote a name and a phone number on the back. This woman works with the Housing Advocacy Office on Lenox Street, she said. She helps people in irregular situations. She won't report you. Tell her everything." Lorraine folded the bulletin and put it in her coat pocket. She finished her lunch. She thanked Bev for the conversation. She got up and left. She used the library phone that Thursday afternoon. She sat at the end of the long table near the reference section, where the chairs were always empty, and she dialed the number Bev had written. It rang 4 times. A woman picked up. Her voice was direct. Not warm, not cold. The voice of someone who spent her days hearing things that most people never hear, and had learned to listen without flinching. Lorraine said her name. She said she had an unusual situation. She said she'd gotten the number from a volunteer at St. Anthony's. The woman said, "Okay, tell me what you've got." Lorraine told her everything. The apartment, 41 years, the rent increase, the eviction, the shelter, the park bench, the officer, the cart, the alley, the door that swung open, the station, the mattress she'd built from foam offcuts, the curtain, the camp stove, the padlock, the crucifix on the wall, the man with the clipboard who said the north section was clear, the yellow card zip-tied to the railing. December 9th, 3 weeks away. She told it all in order the way she might have described the steps of a complicated alteration to a customer. This is what happened. This is what I did. This is where I am now. Here is the problem. The woman was quiet for a moment after Lorraine finished. Not a long silence, just the kind of pause a person takes when they're reorganizing something in their head. Then she said, "Can you come in on Thursday?" Lorraine said yes. She said her name was Janet Holloway. She said the office was on Lenox between 8th and 9th. She said to bring her documents, all of them. Lorraine hung up. She sat at the library table for a minute. She looked at the phone. She looked at the bookshelves along the wall. She opened her book and read for an hour. She had learned over 75 years that worry without action is useless. She had taken action. Now she waited. The second thing she did was prepare her space. She thought carefully about what she wanted them to see when they came down on December 9th. Not if, when. She had decided she would be there when they arrived, present, in her chair, not hiding behind the curtain in the dark, not packed up and gone, not pretending the space was abandoned. If they were going to find her, they were going to find a woman sitting in a folding chair in a room she had built with her own hands. And she was going to make sure they understood exactly what they were looking at. She cleaned the platform. She swept every tile from one end to the other. She wiped down the walls within reach with a damp cloth. She organized the shelf. Documents in order, ID on top, Social Security card behind it, old lease behind that eviction notice at the back. Candles lined up, cup clean, books stacked with the spines facing out. She washed the blanket by hand in the plastic tub, wrung it out, hung it over the wire beside the curtain to dry, then folded it and placed it at the foot of the mattress with the edges aligned. She folded the sleeping bag the same way. She straightened the chair. She leveled the crate table by shimming one corner with a piece of cardboard. She hung a small calendar on the wall above the crucifix. She'd picked it up for free at the bodega on Delaney. It had a picture of a mountain on it somewhere she'd never been. She hung it because a calendar on the wall says something. It says the person living here knows what day it is. It says time is being tracked. It says this is not chaos. This is a life with a structure. She thought about all of this the way she had once thought about difficult alterations. The ones where the customer brought in a dress that didn't fit and wanted it to look like it had been made for them. You had to anticipate what the other person was expecting. You had to understand their eye. And then you gave them something they didn't expect. Something that made them stop and look twice. That was what she was doing. She was altering the room. She was taking a space that anyone walking into it would expect to find empty or wrecked or strewn with the debris of someone falling apart. And she was presenting them with something that made no sense inside their expectations. A home, clean, ordered, maintained with care by a woman who knew what she was doing. She wanted them to stop. She wanted them to look twice. She wanted the moment of hesitation that comes when someone realizes they're not looking at what they thought they were looking at. That hesitation was her only advantage, and she intended to use it. December 9th came gray and cold. The city above her was doing what it always did, grinding, honking, alive in every direction. A jackhammer somewhere going on and off through the ventilation grates like a heartbeat she wasn't part of. She'd been awake since 5. She made real coffee, not instant. Ground coffee from the bodega on Delaney, the same brand they'd kept on the shelf for her all those years. She'd bought it 2 days ago with money she'd been saving. It cost $4, and it was the best $4 she'd spent since August. She brewed it on the camp stove in a small pot and poured it into her good cup. The ceramic one, white with a blue rim, a small chip on the handle where Arthur had knocked it against the faucet 20 years ago. She'd carried that cup from the old apartment to the shelter, to the street, to the park, to the tunnel. It was the only piece of dishware she still owned. She drank the coffee slowly. She was dressed, not in anything new, in clean clothes. Her good blouse, the cream-colored one she'd had for years, ironed the day before, with a small travel iron that Wendell had helped her rig to one of the ventilation conduits a few weeks after she'd moved in. A wire run from a junction box in the ceiling down to an outlet adapter. It worked. It was not legal. She knew that. She was not going to pretend otherwise if anyone asked. Her hair was done. She'd combed it and pinned it the way she always wore it. She sat in her folding chair with her hands in her lap. And she waited. They came at 9:15. She heard the door at the top of the stairs. The thud of heavy boots on concrete. The crackle of a radio. More than one voice, more than two. The flashlight beams came first, sweeping down the stairwell, bouncing off the tile walls. Then the boots. 4 people. She would find that out later. A full team. Lorraine reached over and turned on her lantern. She placed it on the crate table where the light fell across the chair. The shelf, the books, the cup of coffee that was still warm. She sat back. She folded her hands in her lap. The curtain moved aside. A man in a safety vest and hard hat stopped short. Maybe 32, 33 years old. Dark hair, clean-shaven clipboard in one hand, and a camera hanging from a strap around his neck. He had the face of someone who did his job thoroughly and without shortcuts. The kind of face that fills in every line on every form. Behind him, 2 workers in orange high-visibility jackets stopped where they stood. One of them was holding a measuring tape. The other had a flashlight pointed at the floor. A woman came around from the left, suit jacket over a turtleneck, dark hair pulled back. She carried a tablet and a folder and the posture of someone who was in charge and accustomed to being in charge. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The man with the clipboard looked at the lantern on the table. He looked at the camp stove beside it. He looked at the shelf with the documents and the candles and the books. He looked at the calendar on the wall. He looked at the crucifix. He looked at the mattress with the folded blanket on top. He looked at the cup of coffee. He looked at Lorraine. She said, "Good morning." He blinked. He said, "Ma'am." He said, "We're here to do an engineering assessment of this section." She said, "I know. I read the notice." He looked at the people behind him, then back at her. He said, "How long have you been here?" She said, "Since August." A pause. The kind of pause where you can hear people thinking. The woman in the suit stepped forward. Her name was Ms. Hargrove. Lorraine would learn later. She began talking. She talked about unauthorized occupation of public infrastructure. She talked about the Transit Authority's jurisdiction. She talked about the terms of access to decommissioned properties. She talked about liability and safety codes and the legal framework governing the use of city-owned subsurface space. Lorraine let her finish. She let every word land and settle, and she did not interrupt, and she did not argue, and she did not flinch. She sat in her chair, and she listened the way you listen to a rainstorm. You can't stop it. You don't try. You just wait for it to end. When Ms. Hargrove was done, Lorraine said, "Would you like to sit down?" There was nowhere obvious to sit. The woman blinked. The man with the clipboard actually looked around as if a chair might appear from somewhere. One of the workers in orange coughed. Lorraine said, "I'm not going to fight you. I understand who you are and what your paperwork says. I want you to understand who I am and what this is." She stood up. She was 5'2". She was 75 years old. She stood straight. She walked them through her space. She showed them the mattress she'd built from foam offcuts. 3 layers, different densities arranged so the seams didn't align. She explained why. She showed them the sleeping bag and the wool blanket and the way she'd folded them. She showed them the camp stove with the gas safety cutoff and the butane canister stored upright in a ventilated area away from the sleeping space. She showed them the water storage, 2-gallon jugs filled at the library and the park sealed and stored on the platform away from the electrical connection. She showed them the waste routine, the bucket, the daily disposal in the storm drain at the end of the alley. She said she'd been doing it every morning before 6 since August, and she had never missed a day. She showed them the electrical tap, and she told them without apology that it was unauthorized and that she had taken every precaution she knew how to take. She described how Wendell had helped her rig it, how the wire was insulated, how she tested it with the lantern before plugging in the iron, how she only used it for short periods. She showed them her documents on the shelf. She picked them up one by one. Her ID, her Social Security card, her old lease from 1983, the eviction notice. She held out the eviction notice, not to anyone specific, just out, the way you hold out a piece of evidence, the way you show someone the receipt. I had 41 years in that apartment, she said. I have one daughter who can't help, and one son who doesn't pick up the phone. I am not mentally ill. I am not an addict. I am not confused. I am a retired seamstress who fell behind on rent because the new owner raised it by $400 and I had nowhere to go. This is what I built because this is what I had. Nobody said anything. The silence in that station was the loudest thing Lorraine had heard in months. It was louder than the jackhammer above, louder than the traffic, louder than the radio static. It was the silence of four people standing in a room they had expected to find empty, looking at a life they had not expected to find, trying to figure out what to do with what they were seeing. The man with the clipboard looked at Ms. Hargrove. She looked back at him. Something passed between them. The look of people recalculating something they thought they already understood. Ms. Hargrove said, "I'll need to make some calls." She walked back toward the stairs, talking quietly into her phone. Her voice echoed off the tile, but the words were too low to catch. The man with the clipboard stayed where he was. He was looking at the crucifix on the wall. Then he looked at Lorraine. "My grandmother had one of those," he said. "Same size." Lorraine said, "Where's your grandmother now?" He said, "She passed 3 years ago." She nodded. "I'm sorry." He nodded back. He looked at his clipboard. He didn't write anything on it. After about 10 minutes, Ms. Hargrove came back down. Her face had changed. Not softer exactly, more careful. The face of someone who had just had a conversation that didn't go the way they expected. She said they would complete the engineering assessment as scheduled. She said Lorraine would need to speak with someone from the housing office. She said she was not going to escalate this today. That word, escalate, delivered carefully like a door left open a crack instead of locked shut. Not a promise, not a pardon, just a pause. A space between what the rules said and what this woman in a suit had decided to do with the next 24 hours. Lorraine said she understood. She said she already had an appointment with the Housing Advocacy Office on Lenox Street. Ms. Hargrove stopped. "You do," Lorraine said. "I've been planning ahead." They did their assessment. They took measurements of the tunnel walls, the ceiling height, the distance between the platform edge and the track bed. They photographed the structural columns and the ventilation grates in the junction boxes along the ceiling. They were careful around Lorraine's space. They moved past the curtain and the shelf and the mattress without touching anything. One of the workers in orange moved past the curtain without asking. He stepped into her space like it was just another section of tunnel to document. The man with the clipboard said sharply, "Excuse me." The worker stepped back. He didn't apologize with words, but he stepped back, and that was enough. Before he left, the man with the clipboard set something on the crate table. A business card. His name was Eli Prescott. He was an infrastructure surveyor with the Transit Authority. The card had his name and a phone number and nothing else. He said if she needed anything in the next few weeks, she could call. He said he wasn't promising anything. He said it the way a man says something when he wants to promise everything but knows better than to make promises the world might not let him keep. Lorraine looked at the card. She put it on the shelf beside her documents. She said, "Thank you." She meant it. After they left, she sat in her chair for a while, not waiting for anything, just sitting. The way you sit after something large has passed through a room and the air hasn't settled yet. She made another cup of coffee. She picked up her library book. She read for the rest of the morning. She read 22 pages. It was a good book. She did not think about what came next. She had done what she could do, and now it was in other hands. She had learned a long time ago that once something is out of your hands, the only sane thing to do is put your hands to something else. She read. Janet Holloway's office was on the second floor of a building on Lenox Street that looked like it had been a dentist's office in a previous life. Fluorescent lights, thin carpet, a waiting room with 4 chairs and a table covered in pamphlets about tenant rights and emergency assistance programs. Janet was 48 years old. She'd been doing this work for 19 years. She had the eyes of someone who had heard every version of every story and had stopped being surprised by any of them without ever stopping being affected. When Lorraine walked in that Thursday with her Ziploc bag of documents and sat down across the desk and laid out the full situation for the second time, Janet listened without interrupting once. She took notes on a yellow legal pad. She asked 3 questions at the end, all of them specific, all of them about numbers and dates and paperwork. Then she said, "Okay, let's get to work." It wasn't fast. It never is in situations like this. The machinery of housing assistance moves at its own speed, and that speed has nothing to do with the urgency of the person waiting for it. There was paperwork, forms that asked for information Lorraine had, and forms that asked for information she didn't have, and forms that asked for the same information in slightly different ways. There was waiting. Phone calls that rang through to voicemail. Callbacks that came 3 days later. A referral to a different office that turned out to be the wrong office, which referred her to a third office, which was closed on Wednesdays. Janet knew how to navigate this. That was her job. She knew which doors opened and which ones were painted on the wall to look like doors, but went nowhere. She knew which people answered their phones and which people let them ring. She knew the difference between a no that meant no and a no that meant not yet. There was an emergency housing voucher program Lorraine technically qualified for. Her income, her age, her documented history of stable tenancy, her eviction, all of it checked the right boxes. But the waiting list was long, months long. The kind of long that doesn't feel like waiting. It feels like standing still while the world moves around you. Janet knew someone who knew someone at a different office. A subsidized housing unit in the Bronx had opened up. 1 bedroom, ground floor. Heat and hot water included. Rent calibrated to Lorraine's income. Available in February. February. That meant 3 more months in the tunnel. Lorraine took the information. She thanked Janet. She walked to the library and sat at her table and opened her book. 3 more months. She could do 3 months. January was the hardest stretch. The coldest part of the winter hit around the 15th. The temperature above ground dropped into the low 30s and stayed there for a week. Wind came in from the north and turned the streets into corridors of cold that cut through every layer you put between yourself and the air. Down in the tunnel, the temperature dropped too. Not as far, not as fast. The earth held its heat the way it always had, but even the earth has limits. The station dropped into the low 50s during the day and the high 40s at night. Cold enough that your breath showed. Cold enough that the tile walls felt like they were pulling heat out of you when you stood too close. She bought 2 more blankets with money Janet had helped her access through an emergency fund. Heavy blankets. She layered them over the wool in the sleeping bag until the bed was a stack of fabric 6 inches high. She wore her coat to bed for a week, zipped it up to the collar and pulled the hood over her head, and lay on her side with her knees drawn up the way she used to sleep as a child in the house with no heat. Her knees ached in the cold every morning, a deep ache that started in the joints and radiated down into the shins and up into the thighs. The kind of pain that makes you negotiate with yourself about whether getting up is worth it. She got up anyway. She did small exercises on the platform, things she'd read about in a library pamphlet on joint health for older adults. Standing leg lifts, slow knee bends, ankle rotations. She did them in the dark at 6 in the morning on a cold platform floor, and she did not complain. Complaining into an empty tunnel at 6 in the morning seemed like a poor use of time. Wendell kept coming through. He'd heard the boots on the stairs that December morning and had stayed away for 3 days before reappearing. She heard his knock on the pillar 2 slow taps, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. She hadn't known until that moment that she'd been worried he wouldn't come back, that the presence of the inspection team, the official boots, the radio static would scare him off permanently. She stepped out from behind the curtain. He was standing on the platform in his heavy coat hands in his pockets, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something between concern and respect. She told him what had happened. The team, the 4 people, the woman in the suit, the man with the clipboard who had seen the crucifix and mentioned his grandmother. Wendell stood and listened. He nodded slowly when she was done. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You didn't leave." She said, "No." He said, "Why not?" She thought about it, not because she didn't know the answer, because she wanted to say it right. She said, "Because it was mine." He nodded again. He looked at the curtain, at the faint glow of the lantern behind it, at the space she'd made in this forgotten place. He didn't say anything else. He put his hands back in his pockets and walked to the stairs and went up. The next morning, she found a bag of oranges outside the curtain. 6 of them, bright and cold from the night air. She didn't know where he'd gotten them. She didn't ask. She ate one that morning with her coffee. The juice was sharp and sweet, and it tasted like someone giving a damn. February 11th. She was up at 5. She made coffee on the camp stove, the last of the ground coffee from the bodega. She brewed it slowly and poured it into the cup with the chip on the handle, and she held it in both hands and let the heat move through her fingers. She looked around the platform. The lantern was on, throwing its warm circle across the tile. The curtain hung still on its wire. The shelf was neat. The crucifix was on the wall. The calendar showed the right month. The blankets were folded. Everything was in its place. The way she'd kept it since August. The way she would always keep any place she lived. She had spent a week deciding what to take. The camp stove. It had cooked every meal she'd eaten down here. Rice and beans. Soup from cans Wendell left outside the curtain. Oatmeal on cold mornings when the platform floor was too cold to stand on barefoot. That stove was small enough to fit in a cabinet, and it had fed her through a winter underground. It was coming with her. The good cup. The one with the chip. Arthur's carelessness preserved in ceramic. She wrapped it in a cloth and put it in her bag. Arthur's watch, still stopped. Still in the Ziploc, the photographs, all 6 of them. Arthur on the stoop, Jeanette at graduation, Keith in the high chair, the 4 of them at Coney Island, the 2 others, the crucifix. She would take it down last, the wool blanket, the $4 one from the thrift store on Birch. It had kept her warm through the worst week in January when the tunnel dropped below 50. And her knees locked up every morning and she had to talk herself into standing. The library books. She had 3. She needed to return them. She looked at what she was leaving behind. The folding chair. She'd straightened its leg with a rock and a piece of rebar in an alley in September. She'd sat in it every day since, reading, eating, waiting for footsteps on the stairs. It was a good chair. It had done its job. The milk crate shelf, the candles, the water jugs, the bucket, the broom with half its bristles missing, the curtain. She unhooked it from the wire. She folded it. The burgundy fabric sun-faded along the top, heavy in her hands. She set it on the platform floor in a neat square. She wasn't certain why she didn't take it. It would have fit in the cart. It weighed almost nothing for what it was. But it seemed right to leave something behind. As if the place had earned that much from her. As if a room that had sheltered her for 6 months deserved to keep a piece of what had made it a home. She picked up her bag. She looked at the crucifix on the wall. She reached up and took it down. The nail came out of the grout easily. She wrapped the crucifix in a cloth and placed it carefully in the bag, the way she placed it in every bag she'd ever packed when leaving every home she'd ever had. She stood on the platform one last time. The ventilation grates above her let in the winter light. Pale, gray. Thin bars of it crossing the old tile floor, falling across the cream-colored ceramic, and the dark green stripe at eye level. The same light she had first seen in August when she stood at the top of those stairs and looked down into a space she didn't yet know would become the most important room she'd ever occupied. She said nothing. She was not a woman who made speeches to empty rooms. She turned off the lantern. She picked up her bag. She walked to the stairs. She went up. Janet Holloway arrived at 9 with the paperwork in a city van. A caseworker named Darrell was driving. He was a quiet man who opened the back of the van and helped Lorraine load her things without asking questions about where they'd come from. He handled the camp stove and the bag and the blanket and the small box of kitchen things with the same care he would have given furniture from a regular apartment on a regular moving day. They drove north through the city. Lorraine sat in the passenger seat and watched the streets go by. She hadn't been in a car in months. The speed of it felt wrong, too fast. The world outside the window moving in a way that didn't match the pace she'd been living at. She'd been moving at walking speed since July. Cart speed, stair speed. The speed of a woman carrying water jugs down a flight of concrete steps one at a time. The apartment was on the ground floor of a building on Morris Avenue in the Bronx. Darrell pulled up in front and parked, and Lorraine looked at the building through the windshield. Brick. 4 stories. Iron fire escapes on the front. A tree on the sidewalk bare in February, the branches dark and clean against the gray sky. She got out of the van. The apartment was small. 1 bedroom, a kitchen with a window, a bathroom with a tub. The floors were linoleum a little scuffed. The kind of scuffing that comes from years of ordinary living. The radiator sat under the kitchen window. It knocked when the heat came on, a sharp, metallic sound once every few minutes, like the building was clearing its throat. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the window. The light came through it flat and pale. February light, winter light. Gray and thin and quiet. The same light that used to come through the ventilation grates. But from above now, not from below. She put the crucifix above the front door. First thing, before she unpacked anything else, before she put the cup in the cabinet or the blanket on the bed or the photographs on the shelf. She found a nail in the kitchen drawer left behind by whoever had lived here before, and she pressed it into the wall above the doorframe and hung the crucifix and stepped back and looked at it. It hung straight, the way it always did. She arranged the apartment the way she liked it. The stove in the kitchen, the real stove, the one that came with the apartment, had 4 burners and an oven and a pilot light that clicked 3 times before catching. She turned it on and off twice just to hear the sound of it. She kept the place clean. She kept it orderly. She made the bed in the morning and washed the dishes after every meal. The building had a superintendent named Eddie, who fixed things within a week if you asked politely. She asked politely. She found the neighborhood library 4 blocks north on a street with a laundromat and a bakery. She went in and presented her old library card, and the woman behind the desk looked at it and typed something into the computer and said it was still active. Lorraine checked out 2 books and walked home with them under her arm. She found a church 6 blocks west. Not the same one. Not Father Donnelly. A different church with a different priest and a different pew, but the same words in the same silence, in the same places during the service. She went on the first Sunday after she moved in and sat in the 3rd row from the back, on the left side, because that was where she always sat. She found a bodega on the corner of Morris and the cross street that stocked her brand of coffee. The same brand. She didn't know if it was coincidence or if every bodega in the city carried it. But she bought a bag and brought it home and brewed it in the morning and drank it from the cup with the chip on the handle. And it tasted the same way it had always tasted. Like mornings. Like the beginning of a day that belonged to her. She called Jeanette. She sat in the kitchen with the phone in her hand and the light coming through the window. And she dialed her daughter's number and waited for her to pick up. Jeanette answered on the 2nd ring. She said hello the way she always did, quick and slightly breathless, like she was in the middle of something. Lorraine said, "I have an address now." A silence. Short. The kind of silence that happens when someone's throat closes and they need a moment to open it again. Jeanette said she was so relieved. She said she was sorry. She said she wanted to come visit. She said she'd been thinking about Lorraine every day. She said things were getting better. She said she should have done more. She said a lot of things that came out fast and tangled the way things come out when they've been sitting inside someone for too long. Lorraine said, "Come in the spring." She said it without anger. She said it without blame. She'd had 6 months alone in the dark with everything she had ever felt about her kids and the eviction and the silence on the other end of the phone. And she had worked through most of it, the way she worked through everything slowly, deliberately, one piece at a time, turning it over in her hands until she understood its shape. And what was left after all that work wasn't worth carrying around. She never told Jeanette about the tunnel. Not that day. Maybe someday. Maybe not. Some things belong to the person who lived them, and nobody else. Eli Prescott called once, about a month after the inspection. She was in the kitchen. The radiator was knocking. She'd gotten used to the sound. It was company of a kind. He said he just wanted to check in. He said he'd been thinking about the station and wanted to know how things had turned out. He said it casually, the way people say things that aren't casual at all. She told him she was in an apartment in the Bronx, ground floor. She had a kitchen with a window. He said that was really good to hear. She said, "Thank you for the card." He said he hadn't done anything. She said, "Yes, you did." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means a person is hearing something they needed to hear. Then he said, "Good luck, ma'am." She said, "I don't need luck. I've got a kitchen window." She heard him laugh. A real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere below the surface. She hung up. She put the phone down on the kitchen table. Outside on Morris Avenue, a car radio was playing something with a strong bass line. A kid on a bike went past the window calling out to someone down the block. The radiator knocked. The light came in flat and pale through the kitchen window. The same gray winter light that used to fall through the ventilation grates. But from above now. Not from below. It landed on the table where Lorraine sat with her coffee and her library book. She turned the page.